Hi, my name is Ginny, also known as Two-Thirds Lotus, and this clip is part of my series analyzing the Essential Bukowski, edited by Abel DeBrito. Nothing has been edited out, so you're seeing this exactly as it was streamed on Twitch, with all the imperfections and tangents of a live stream. If you want to learn more or catch me live, make sure to check out the description, otherwise enjoy the incredible work of Charles Bukowski. The Priest and the Matador. In the slow Mexican air, I watched the bull die as they cut off his ear, and his great head held no more terror than a rock. Driving back the next day, we stopped at the mission and watched the golden red and blue flowers pulling like tigers in the wind. Set to this metric, the bull and the fort of Christ, the matador on his knees with the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. You may argue in the marketplace and pull at your doubts with silken strings. I will only tell you this: I have lived in both their temples, believing all and nothing. Perhaps now they will die in mine. And a very, very Bukowski drawing. I like to draw like this, and I liked to draw like this, like the sort of scribbly, very gestural art, before I ever saw that Bukowski did it too, which was mildly terrifying and maybe an omen of my future alcoholism, whatever. Dude, I desperately want to write poetry from my character's perspective, but I legit have no clue what they would write. Yeah. I forgot to submit my poems for today in Times New Roman, formatted in Arial like a chump. Dang. How tragic. This will greatly affect my interpretation of the poetry. So, I'm going to read this again. I'm going to dive into actually saying things that mean things. The Priest and the Matador. In the slow Mexican air, I watched the bull die, and they cut off his ear, and his great head held no more terror than a rock. Driving back the next day, we stopped at the mission and watched the golden, red, and blue flowers pulling like tigers in the wind. Set to this metric, the bull and the fort of Christ, the matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. You may argue in the marketplace and pull at your doubts with silken strings. I will only tell you this: I have lived in both temples, believing all and nothing. Perhaps now they will die in mine. To be fair, Arial is easier to read. My relationship with font is not poly unless I'm doing D&D props. TNR is my wife. I was raised on TNR. Yeah, I mean, I'm a Times New Roman girly, I think. Admittedly, I most prefer handwriting and character in that, but if I am to type, well, I also don't bother to format it, so I end up writing all of my things in Arial, so whatever. It's interesting the beginning starts just like 2 sentences in a story, but then it transforms into a poem. Yeah. It's very descriptive. We get great imagery here. And even then, like, you're writing whatever fits. Fair enough. And you change Drowning Devil. No. Drowning Devil. No, it's the other person in chat who... Penguino Man is the one who changes the color of their page for the different poems, which I love. Driving back the next day, we stopped at the mission and watched the golden red and blue flowers pulling like tigers in the wind. And even then, that's very, like, good imagery as well, and that in itself could also be the start of a kind of normal story. It's not prose, right? I just winced I've never marked up a book in my life. Have you not seen us do Bukowski? Because we draw goddamn graphs on Bukowski. We have color schemes on Bukowski. Bukowski is not safe for my pens. I saw it briefly one time before I left. Yeah, no, I give no sanctity to a book that I have no intention of sort of passing on to another person or whatever. Like, sometimes I'll write in pencil or a finer pen if it's a book that, like, maybe I want someone else to read. Like, let's say I have Invitation to a Beheading here by Nabokov. My notes are much more sparse. I tend to underline, and I think finding a used book and finding underlines and seeing what the past person, like, wrote is a very beautiful thing. That's also my in the text note writing, which is super, super fine. Don't let me distract you. Distraction is the essence of life. I don't analyze the books I read, but I do write my thoughts in the margins and underline things. That's analytical thought. Don't diminish that. So, the third stanza kind of blows my mind every time I reread it, and maybe I'm just reading it wrong. But, set to this metric, colon. First of all, I'm not quite sure what metric he's talking about. The bull and the fort of Christ, colon, the matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, semicolon, set this to metric. Y'all, sometimes I cannot read. That's crazy. Set this to metric. That's very funny. And yes, the method by which we measure something. Well, wow. I do this a lot. I feel like words get switched around. Set this to metric. The bull and the fort of Christ. So this is more to say, like, measure these things against each other. So, set this to metric. Thank you, Brian Liu. Yeah, or, now look at it this way. That sounds like dyslexia, Jin. Maybe? It would be very minor if it was. But there was a poem, I mean, it was in one of Brian's poems that I read Foundation as Fountain, like, multiple times. And I definitely do that sometimes. But it's not chronic. It doesn't affect me that much. I'm also, like, looking up and down a lot, which is probably something. Set this to metric. So, consider the following as related, right? The bull and the fort of Christ. So then, saying, Bukowski kind of tells us, this is a really interesting move for a poem. Not sure I've, like, seen this kind of line before. The bull and the fort of Christ. Compare these things. He tells us. Consider the following, he would say if he was Bill Nye. Please consider the following. The matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. And really, this is a really wonderful way to just start hearing Bill, 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 Bill. Yeah. When I read Bukowski, I start hearing bim, 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 bim in my head. So this is like maybe one of the more poetic ways I've seen someone in a poem use analogy or simile. I know they're like close, but basically the same thing. Analogy, right? Saying the bull and the matador, that's a simile, right? The bull is to the matador as, that's a simile, right? As the priest, or rather the fort of Christ, the mission is to the priest. Whoa, okay. I think this is why you take time to look at things. So, the bull and the fort of Christ. These things are on the same side. This is why like this format of simile is actually useful. You might have learned this in school. So, the bull is to the matador as the fort is to the priest. And that's a really interesting dynamic. I might have learned this in school, but I certainly don't remember it. That's fair. I just have really good memory for like school things. So that is to say that the bull, so basically this structure means that the relation of the bull to the matador is the same as the relation of the fort to the priest. Now the bull is subject to the matador in like being his subjects to like, let's say a king, or in subjugation, right? Below the matador is in control. In a sense, we go as far as to say that the matador has killed the bull. The fort, if he is saying to set it to that metric, look at the analogy this way, or the simile this way. He says the fort is also the same in its relation to the priest. Thus, the fort is in some way subject to the priest. That's how I read it. I'm reading it as the dead bull is the baby of the matador. Oh, yes. The dead bull, his baby. That is... That too, a baby. I guess I was looking back at this relation here, the bull dying to the matador, but yes, more immediately he says that the dead bull is his baby, and the fort would similarly be the baby of the priest. Which is still a sort of sense of control, ownership. I don't think you're being too literal. I did just sort of miss that line. I didn't read ahead. I can write poems, never said I could analyze them. There's no such thing as an incorrect analysis. And the priest staring from the window, like a caged bear. Which is weird, because in a sense it makes it sound like the priest is somehow trapped. Caged bear. looking out of the window. Which is weird when also the analogy or the simile is saying, or the metric is that the priest has the relation to the fort that the matador does have the bull, which is not trapped. It is quite the opposite. It is being in control over it. Everyone has the ability to analyze. It's a muscle you have to work for. Yeah. Yeah. I do this every day. The bull in the fort of Christ, the matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. Bench press poetry. That really does sound like the name of like a recurring weekly poetry open mic or slam that occurs in a gym. Or like in the parking lot, you know? Because no one's gonna let poets into the gym. Instead of this metric, the bull and the fort of Christ, the matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. And this does make sense, kind of, to me. A baby does imply a sort of obligation, right? One must care for, one is obligated to care for a baby. The matador, in being a matador, has an obligation to kill the bull. In the same way that the priest has an obligation, even if he feels or looks like a caged bear, to care for his mission. For those unfamiliar, because this is sort of... So a mission is like the building that gets set up when the missionary goes and basically like builds a church somewhere to like convert them. And there were lots of these in Mexico when the Spaniards came to colonize. You may argue in the marketplace and pull at your doubts with silken strings. I will only tell you this. I have lived in both temples, believing all and nothing. Perhaps now they will die in mine. So Bukowski says that he has his own temple. One temple here, right, is that of the bull. This is a temple. And of course, the fort, the mission, is a temple. Bukowski also has his temple, which I immediately assume is talking about his art. In that question, was this written during his Buddhist era? I have no idea. Why do you ask? The Priest and the Matador by Bukowski. Poem originally appeared spring 1962. So I think this is pretty early Bukowski. Yeah, because he got like more Buddhist as like more like in 70, 80, I think. I just looked up whether a matador is obligated to kill the bull. I thought they didn't have to. Not only is the goal to thrust the sword quickly through the bull's shoulder blade, but if the bull kills the matador, another matador comes out to kill the bull, and often the bull's mother is killed as well. She is considered the source of the bull's evil qualities. Yeah. I don't know, it feels more nihilistic. More thoughtful and less nihilistic. Yeah. And knowing Bukowski, I really see two things as his temple, which could contrast the temples. No, it's super interesting. Don't apologize. Any context helps the story, or helps the analysis of the sort of story, our story, in analyzing. Now, art. Now, I think his temple could also be like vice, which would be the more nihilistic sense. And by that I mean these two people, their temples is kind of the world, the way they see things. The matador theoretically exists in a world of spectacle, right? The matador is an entertainer, and bullfighting is this grand thing with the flowing cape, the charging bull, the matador usually dressed very, like, beautifully, I would say, in their, like, attire, right? They have, like, the fancy coats and stuff. So that is, like, spectacle to me, and maybe almost, like, something that is grand and demonstrative and big and loud. The priest, his temple, of course, is the more literal one of religion and, like, modesty and less things, which I would say is a great foil, a great contrast to the matador. The matador creates a temple of entertainment, of noise, where the priest creates a quiet temple and, like, a very faithful temple. It's also the idea that the bull, like the baby, is an innocent, something with an animal intelligence that has been slain. Yeah. Seems like a digression. Maybe. I think baby is probably intentional. I think Bukowski is, the more I read, extremely intentional with each of his words. But, so we ask then, what is Bukowski's temple? And Bukowski being Bukowski, perhaps now they will die in, right? He has lived in spectacle, he has lived religious, but now he's in a different place. If he has departed from those, one departure from religion is that he is, again, as I wrote there, living this life of vice. Prostitutes, alcohol, but not drugs. Prostitutes, alcohol, that was his main two vices, right? And it is also kind of a departure from that spectacle because it's a very private thing. It's not for anyone. It's not that sort of something. His temple is his mind. He has considered all and put the thoughts to rest. Maybe. Yeah. Like, he has lived in them in that he has experienced. Living in the temples was experiencing those thoughts, those things, and they will die in his mind in that perhaps he does not engage with these things, right? It doesn't feel like he likes the matador. Talking about the way the bull dies, it feels like Bukowski does have some amount of empathy for the bull. Its great head having no more terror than a rock, right? Something beautiful and great being reduced to lifeless, and then similarly talking about the priest as a caged bear, an animal making less of this person in the same way that the bull is made less of, right? So it could be that he has sort of considered these in his mind and is putting them to rest, either coping with the fact of the death of the bull or sort of saying that these lives are not for him, right? I also think there's an interpretation maybe that his temple as a poet is his art. And I'll talk about that one after I drink some water and take a self-care ad break, because my voice is pretty not great sounding right now. Don't watch the ads, y'all. Sneeze. Ah. What do you think of the poem, Harper? Come here. Come here, Harper. Good boy. You are like the matador. You have much fiery spectacle and energy. Wave to stream. I don't know if they can see you. Harper. Okay. Squeeze back in a stretch. I really like having these quick breaks. They help me think. Good. Yeah, I never advise just sitting and trying to force yourself to stay still and do something. Usually when I'm writing poetry at my best, I'm like walking around with my notebook in hand, like pacing, I'm moving, right? Even if I'm like sitting in a coffee shop, I write poetry better if I'm able to turn and twist and scoot around in circles. In my stool, if it's like at like a window seat, or if it's a chair, it's a little less conducive. So yeah, being able to stand up and stretch is good. So perhaps his temple is his art. Art being an act that sort of diverts from spectacle. Spectacle diverts from religion, because art is an act of creation. And he probably considers this maybe having no longer believed the religion and having some more belief than the matador that creation is something better. Good morning, Nico. How was your poetry slam? I must know. And here's a line that I didn't catch before until just now. He says, I've lived in both their temples, believing all and nothing. This line was awesome. Nice. I think, so believing all would perhaps refer to the priest's temple. He was once a believer. And he has also once believed nothing. Believed nothing in the temple of the matador. I do think even if he wasn't in his sort of later career Buddhist era, right? Even if he wasn't in that later era of career, I fear he may still have been someone who appreciated life, animals, all things. Also, for those not understanding, drowning devil, redeemed. A point redeem where I have to speak like a spoken word poet for 5 minutes, and probably maybe more, because, to be quite honest, it's inspiring to talk like this, try to rhyme things in what would normally be a sort of talkative bliss. But this makes me think, how can I sound more like a poetic? Continuing, the priest is where one might believe in all things, where the matador believes nothing. Ha, I got stuck. Yes. Get loud and then immediately quiet. Yes, of course. That's spoken word. I also have to try not to, be quiet. Because if I were to silence myself in a time when I'm told to speak in a certain way, would I really be engaging with the things that you have paid for me to... something. William Shatner? I'm not familiar with a man named Shatner. However... Dramatic pauses? Ah. Well, moving forward with the analysis, because we can't just stop in some sort of paralysis, I was talking about the matador. Theatrics. So, the matador is the temple of nothing. He has no problem killing an animal that's innocent for a spectacle, for a show, for the people who want to watch it. However, I think Bukowski had lived in that temple of destitution, that temple of nothing, where the matador were the people were willing to kill. And he said that wasn't for him, it made him feel ill. So now he has grown into a new place in between, some place of creation, some place where he can have some artistic station. Art. Poetry. The things we do that connect you and me. That don't have death, but don't have the division and the derision, the decisions that religion makes for our lives. That was a good one. Because the priest on the other side is so obsessed with life. Against death of the matador. The religious feasts, the candles, and their perfect glowing heat. And Bukowski doesn't like that either, because that's not very free. So what lands in between? Art. Probably. Poetry. It's perhaps my argument for that being Bukowski's temple. Of course, that's the one thing that he provides, creates the thing that he is a caretaker over, because in the same way that the matador ends the bowl, brings its life to start, to buried in a hole. Bukowski is the genesis of the poem The Exodus unto the audience, where the priest would take those as books, as rules, as law, as testament. A teacher scolding us. Bukowski can use those things as art. It's really hard to keep going because I want to start a new train of thought about the poem. But I'm talking in spoken word and I have to somehow navigate those straits to get there. This is such a fun point reading. I'm really tired of this shit. So that's kind of my description of why I'm convinced that Bukowski's temple is his artistic mission, not the mission of the Mexican conquistador, the colonizer, the one who kills. Interesting, the parallel here in this poem between the religious man as the one who kills and then builds and claims to be doing something of peace, having ceased the killing of the bull in the place from whence he came. Those roles have been reversed. Like the roll of the dice over time, it seems that things get shuffled up in their minds and then somehow they've divided these two minds. I already said that. What a tragedy. So, that's an interesting parallel. Come to open mic November 7th. Taverna again downstairs. Spoken word is over. I know. So that was 5 minutes of me talking like a spoken word poet and improvising poetry. Yeah. I've been meaning to get back to the Taverna open mics. Thank you for redeeming that. That's a fun one. It's hard to keep the analysis. So what I was saying, if you couldn't follow, is that the matador believes in nothing. The matador will kill a bull for sport. The priest sort of venerates life. Oh, thank you for the hydrate. Jug. And yet, also, the priest is in the same way a violent person. I don't know if that's something Bukowski maybe acknowledges here, but it's something I would like to point out. Ooh, good crack on the back. Is that he the priest is part of this tradition of the missions, I rhymed that earlier, and religion, which Spaniards came into Mexico, took over, killed a bunch of people and all this stuff, which is an interesting parallel between these two temples, where that killing was from a different place, but killing nonetheless. And maybe that's the key. Maybe Bukowski at this time is already sort of considering Buddhism. I don't really know when he started to really get into these beliefs of his, but his temple of creation, his temple of art, his temple also of vice, which is only self-destructive, is maybe also a temple for him of peace. He talks very highly of alcoholics. We heard that. Actually, no, we didn't hear that in the video. I watched a video of Bukowski like last night or something, or 2 nights ago, where he talks again about alcoholism, because he always talks about alcoholism, and he speaks very highly of it and the energy that it gives you, which is not something I agree with, right? But it kind of makes sense. So his temple of peace, of vice, and of art, perhaps now they will die in mine. he only hopes that this matador can see the erring of his ways, and same with the priest. That believing all is not useful. Die in mind. Okay. I've lived in both their temples, believing all and nothing. Perhaps now they will die in mine. Die in my temple. What is his temple? The thing that he presides over. Art, vice, creation, peace, potentially, as we've said. So he hopes maybe that these two will move away from their extreme ends of life and find themselves somewhere in the middle. And that might be what he's saying. There is some Buddhism in that. Buddhism talks about walking the middle path. That no extreme action in one direction or one thought or one practice is going to take you to a place of enlightenment. As far as I understand it, the Pali Canon is cryptic. It's the early Buddhist texts. And also just as a work of philosophy, to not value such extremes of life. He says maybe, if we're taking this philosophically, life is not to be lived at either end of things. Life is to be lived with some amount of temperance. Bukowski, his main talking point philosophically, which we haven't talked about much, is don't try. Bukowski says you should not, if you're going to work a job, you shouldn't try to get up and go to the job. You shouldn't have to try to live your life. Your life should be something you live naturally. And that feels connected to me, maybe, with the idea of not living these extremes. Trying to entertain, trying to provide faith. Maybe he says just to find somewhere in the middle, somewhere more comfortable and somewhere more real as your temple. You may argue in the marketplace and pull at your doubts with silken strings. I will only tell you this. I think this kind of just reads as sort of a cheeky, I know more than you as the poet, and I'm not going to reveal all my secrets. You can argue and doubt and try to figure out exactly what I mean here. And my last sort of hint as to interpreting the dynamic of the bull and the matador and the temple and the priest, or the mission and the priest, is that he has spent time in both their temples. That's all he will tell you. I don't think there's necessarily some sort of greater symbolic meaning in that line. And if we're talking like before about whether Bukowski really goes bim 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 and provides interest throughout every line in this poem, I would say he does quite a good job. The first story part with the imagery is very gripping. In slow Mexican air, I watched the bull die, and they cut off his ear, and his great head held no more terror than a rock. It has this flow to it, right? Driving back the next day, jumping ahead, moving forward. Bukowski doesn't wait. That feels like his idea, and I'll write it again. I have to write it kind of like I imagine how Bukowski would write it, which is all caps and very angular. Bim bim bim. Right. Driving back the next day, we stopped at the mission and watched the golden red and blue flowers pulling like tigers in the wind. Set to this metric, The bull and the fort of Christ, the matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. Set this to metric. I keep saying set to this metric. Set this to metric. You may argue in the marketplace and pull your doubts with silken strings. I will only tell you this. I've lived in both their temples, believing all and nothing. Perhaps now they will die in mine. There's not exactly a line there that feels slow to me. That feels like it isn't taking us in a new direction. Right? And that tends to be, the beauty of Bukowski, is that I personally think he follows his advice pretty often, but you all are free to disagree. If I were to critique Bukowski, because I say that we ought to critique everything, even if they are on pedestals, we should critique Shakespeare, we should critique Bukowski, we should critique Mary Oliver, what would I say? It's always hard. With Bukowski, it's kind of like a prize fight. He always provides so much and so much character and so much energy, and to critique it feels like he'd punch you in the face and tell you you're wrong. But The Priest and the Matador. While calling it a prize fight about a poem dealing with a bullfight, I know. Honestly worth it? Yeah. So, title, The Priest and the Matador. I think this is useful. It shows the connection of the priest and the matador as these two characters, and then the bull and the fort, right? This sort of simile that he uses. In the slow Mexican air, I watched the bull die, and they cut off his ear, and his great head held no more terror than a rock. I love to tell a legend that they fucked something up and be right about it. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we try to do. You want to try to find something that everyone can improve on when you're analyzing, because otherwise, I don't know, you're not engaging. It's another direction you can engage and another muscle to flex, really. If we're at the bench press poetry evening slam and bar fight poetry reading of Charles Bukowski. Driving back the next day, we stopped at the Mission and watched the golden red and blue flowers pulling like tigers in the wind. So I've been sort of struggling actually so far with this line to decide how exactly this relates to the priest's relation to his temple, like a caged bear. I mean, perhaps he wants to be outside in this freedom, in what he would probably call the beautiful creation of God. And maybe that makes it just a serene image. Yeah. And maybe that's to say that while the Matador is a depiction of violence and spectacle, his is serene, and he cages himself inside and is sort of humbling himself to this life, right? Maybe the flowers are just that sign of freedom he can't have. Yeah, and I mean, the bullfight really is one of freedom as well. It's this freeing thing, maybe, I'd imagine, to kill something much greater than you are. It sounds awful, I would never do it, but to kill the bull is perhaps freedom as opposed to saying something on the Instagram. Okay. Where the tiger fits in. I think maybe I was wondering that too, and I think maybe that Yeah, I think that's more a power trip. Though I suppose that is a form of freedom. Yeah, and that's what I mean. Yeah, a power trip. But it's sort of freeing, and then it gives you this power. Power makes one feel free, unfortunately. Lack of power is lack of freedom. Lack of power over yourself is lack of freedom. The bull is not free as it is being killed, right? The ultimate freedom is maybe that over your life. Talk about the fundamental freedoms, right? But like tigers in the wind, this maybe, I mean, if we were to relate it to the bull, it's a powerful animal, but it's also a sort of quieter one. And perhaps that is to say that the priest I think maybe in like this serene, beautiful scene, it's not to say that it's just pretty, but there's maybe some amount of power to that field of flowers. That the serenity of the mission and the serenity of God is a powerful thing, powerful in the same way that a tiger is, but also elusive in ways that the bull is not, perhaps. Tiger does feel like an equally powerful animal, but one much different from the bull. And then we also talk about caged bears. So this is just giving like a through line and maybe capitalizing on that. On that metaphor of strong animals, so good on him. Didn't miss that opportunity. Set this to metric. The bull in the fort of Christ, the matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. Like, I feel like this says in as few words as possible, like, here is the analogy that I'm trying to get at. And Bukowski's like, I think Bukowski's good at this. Bukowski is hard to critique. If anyone has things they don't like about this poem, or things that they critique, or things they think could do better, tell me. Because it's hard. And B versus Bukowski, I lose every time. But I have a few of you to help me. You may argue in the marketplace and pull at your doubts with silken strings. I will only tell you this. I've lived in both their temples, believing all in nothing. Perhaps now they will die in mine. What do you all think of you may argue in the marketplace and pull your doubts with silver strings? Pull at your doubts with silken strings. I mean, the idea of pulling at something with a string, not quite touching it, perhaps also like a marionette, or just not quite being there, tugging at something. The metaphor is over my head right now. It's over my head too. I think it's my mind's made up, maybe yours isn't. Yeah, like this is talking to the reader, right? You may argue with another person in the same way maybe that people in the market haggle and try to get the best thing out of it. You know, he is talking about religious metaphor, and a marketplace next to or in a temple is a direct scene, a direct biblical scene. Right? Basically for those who are not informed, this is in the New Testament, which is the part with, like, Jesus. And he pulls up to Jerusalem. Big ol' city, oh God. Oh, the Jews, right? And says, hey, yo, why are there all these money lenders and, like, scammers and thieves just chilling in the temple where Jesus flips out in the market? Yeah. And he yells and he flips tables. And if you want to watch, I think the scene from Jesus Christ Superstar, the movie, is an excellent depiction. Also, the music is great. And Andrew Lloyd Webber. It's just a win all around. But in that sense, these people are misguided in the temple. And that would mean he's calling readers potentially misguided in this way, if that is the metaphor. And I do think he has used Christian metaphor and has in this poem. So I would say, given the context, it makes sense, right? And a market and a temple, it feels right, right? So then if these people are misguided, that is maybe to say anyone arguing and trying to ease all the doubts over this poem and find the true interpretation is kind of wrong, which is actually a direct attack at me if I interpret it that way, right? That since I'm arguing in the marketplace over this poem, pulling at doubts over silken strings, trying to find the perfect temple to live in, trying to cast away doubt and be correct, he says that's not right. And I mean, there is a sense of finality in both of the temples described in the poem. The temple of the priest, religious perfection being correct. The bowl, the finality of death. There's a certainty in that. And Bukowski, maybe his temple is also uncertain. He has decided to not live in these temples, live somewhere in between. And going back to his philosophy of don't try, which he very often says, and this might be a sort of way that he is saying it to us. Don't try to force yourself into extremes. Don't try to find the perfect interpretation of this poem, but instead live in the temple, his temple, the real life temple, the temple of art, the temple of vice, the temple of peace, creation, all of these things, which Bukowski is this twisted champion of throughout his poems. And I was trying to critique him there by finding things I didn't understand. And the difficulty is, once you do enough analysis and are able to find meaning in anything, it gets really hard to critique because you're just able to say, no, I think this might actually relate to the poem, right? And Bukowski does a great job of not having dead words where it goes da 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 da. The person woke up and went out onto their porch and sat on the chair and looked at the morning sun, da 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 da. That's what he says in his video, right? That's the hardest part about analysis. Where do you end? Yeah, I can go into everything. The slow Mexican air versus the tigers in the wind. That's contrast between these two things. That's analysis, right? Slow Mexican air and stillness. Movement of the flowers. There's another connection that he does in his poem, which I hadn't even caught till now. Like, I can look at any word that I haven't already quote-unquote analyzed and put meaning into and find meaning for it, right? Which is super difficult. It's kind of like it's participating in the art, and the issue of many artists is, when do I stop, right? When is the piece done? And maybe that's a lesson to take from this, asking the question of when analysis is done, right? That's a good point, Brian. So, I do sort of fail to find critique on this poem, which sucks. I want to critique Bukowski. One, because he's awful. And two, because, like, I hate reading something and that people say is great and then just, like, agreeing. It's always good to find something that can be done better. This poem isn't perfect, and Bukowski would tell you this poem isn't perfect, and I don't know why. And that's part of analysis, right? So we were talking about Bukowski. And his life of vice. And his temple of professional alcoholism and sleeping with whores and not caring for his daughter or his wife, right? This is the temple that Bukowski tells us he hopes other people will die in. And this is maybe a point where we remember that Bukowski is fundamentally the greatest, like, unreliable narrator in poetry, right? He seems to consider his life good. He talks about being an alcoholic in a positive way in interviews. He talks about these things like he doesn't dislike them. And he says that he would rather be in this place where he is not believing all but not believing nothing, somewhere in between his temple. And I don't know if that fact makes this poem better or worse, because we can safely assume that his decision is not one we want to make. And he kind of tells us, in a sense, I will only tell you this. Basically, I've made my decision. I've decided to live my life. And you may either argue or figure out a way to live yours. And decide. And be decisive. Like he sounds like the man that knows he's not a good person and knows where he can improve, but he doesn't want to change. Absolutely. Bukowski doesn't want to change. Bukowski likes being an alcoholic. He talks about this. Sometimes he talks about it in jest and in positivity. I doubt he always enjoyed his alcoholism. I find it interesting then, perhaps a contradiction in his own logic here, that he hopes or suggests that other people will die in his temple. It sort of has this deep amount of confidence in the way he lives his life, which is so backwards. And then he goes and suggests maybe that others ought to, or that maybe they will, die in his temple. Or live their life somewhat in his temple. And maybe that is the sort of messed up part of this poem. And not even that that's critique, but to suggest that others might want to live his life. And maybe that's more of a philosophical disagreement and critique of this poem as I interpret it than an actual critique of the writing. But that's the best I can do, is to maybe critique his philosophy. Or the fact that he is in this poem perhaps leaning toward imposing his philosophy on other people. Because when he talks about don't try, when he talks about writing and by extension living life with this momentum, this movement, this bim bim bim, I agree with him a lot of times. But I also don't agree with being an alcoholic myself. I think it's okay to be an alcoholic. I think you should probably work on that for your own sake if it causes you suffering, but that's maybe my critique of this poem. My client is watching 31 Villains by a YouTuber analyzing top-ranked villains of all time among literature. Lego is number 1. So it's analysis all day here. Shakespeare villains, I see. Well, that sounds fascinating. So I'm going to read this one more time, because I've had enough of this poem. And all the Wi-Fi drops, which means this one might not be able to, Lego. Yeah. It's an I? Iago? That's crazy. I don't like I's and L's. We need to do better in our typefaces of I guess I should have known it's a proper noun. You would have capitalized it. True that. Serifs. I love serifs. What if I wish I could put my chat in Times New Roman? That'd be great. But here's the priest and the matador. In the slow Mexican air, I watched the bull die, and they cut off his ear. And his great head held no more terror than a rock. Driving back the next day, we stopped at the mission and watched the golden red and blue flowers pulling like tigers in the wind. Set this to metric. The bull and the fort of Christ, the matador on his knees, the dead bull his baby, and the priest staring from the window like a caged bear. You may argue in the marketplace and pull at your doubts with silken strings. I will only tell you this. I've lived in both their temples, believing all and nothing. Perhaps now they will die in mine. The Priest and the Matador by Charles Bukowski. Thanks for listening to me and my thoughts on Bukowski. Make sure to check out the rest of the series if you enjoyed, and follow or stop by Twitch if you want to see more. See you there.